I never thought a simple walk through Central Park would completely transform my life. It was one of those gray October afternoons when the city feels especially cold and indifferent. I'd been walking aimlessly for hours, trying to escape the suffocating silence of my studio apartment. At 26, I felt like I was drowning in a sea of loneliness that New York City seemed to amplify rather than cure. That's when I saw him. An elderly man sitting alone on a weathered wooden bench, feeding pigeons from a small paper bag. His silver hair caught what little sunlight filtered through the clouds, and despite his advanced age, there was something remarkably alert about his posture. He wore a navy blue coat that had seen better days, but his eyes held a warmth that seemed to cut through the autumn chill. I was about to walk past when he looked up and smiled at me with such genuine kindness that I found myself slowing down. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" he said, though the sky was overcast and threatening rain. His voice carried a slight accent I couldn't quite place, but there was something musical about it that made me want to hear more. I stopped walking entirely. "I suppose it is," I replied, though I didn't really mean it. Something about his presence made me feel less invisible than I had in months. The pigeons cooed softly around his feet, completely at ease with this stranger who had somehow made a cold park bench feel like the warmest place in the city. "Mind if I sit?" I asked, gesturing to the empty space beside him. He patted the bench enthusiastically, as if he'd been waiting for me all along. As I settled in beside him, he continued scattering breadcrumbs, and I watched the gentle way he moved his hands, as if each small gesture carried decades of practiced kindness. "I'm Marcus," I said, extending my hand. His grip was surprisingly firm for someone who must have been in his 80s. "And I'm Harold," he replied. "Harold Goldstein. Been coming to this bench for 15 years now." He chuckled softly. "The pigeons know my schedule better than I do." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the birds dance around our feet. I found myself studying Harold's profile, noticing the laugh lines that mapped a lifetime of joy across his weathered face. There was something almost magnetic about his presence, a quality that made me want to stay longer, to learn his story. "You know," Harold said suddenly, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "I've been watching you walk past this bench for weeks now. Same time every day. Same lost expression on your face." He turned to look at me directly, and I felt as though he could see straight through to my soul. "You look like a young man who's forgotten how to connect with the world around him." His words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were so achingly accurate. I'd been sleepwalking through life for months, maybe even years, going through the motions of existing without really living. Work, sleep, with nothing meaningful in between. "I suppose you're right," I admitted, surprised by my own honesty. "I moved here 2 years ago thinking the city would cure my loneliness, but it's only made it worse. Everyone's so busy, so disconnected. I feel invisible most days." Harold nodded knowingly, as if he'd heard this story countless times before. "New York can be the loneliest place on earth if you don't know how to navigate it," he said. "But it can also be the most magical place to find unexpected connections." He paused, studying my face with those penetrating eyes. "You need company, and I need a friend." The simplicity of his statement caught me off guard. There was no pretense, no social maneuvering, just an honest acknowledgement of mutual need. In a world where everyone seemed to be putting on masks and playing games, Harold's directness was like a breath of fresh air. "What did you have in mind?" I asked, genuinely curious about what friendship with this enigmatic old man might look like. Harold smiled mysteriously, a glint of mischief in his eyes that made him look decades younger. "Come back tomorrow at the same time," he said, standing up and brushing breadcrumbs from his coat. "I want to show you something that might change how you see this city forever." Before I could ask what he meant, he was walking away, his gait steady and purposeful despite his age. As I watched him disappear into the crowd of afternoon joggers and dog walkers, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. For the first time in months, I had somewhere to be, someone to see. Harold had awakened something in me that I'd thought was permanently dormant. That night, I found myself thinking about our encounter over and over again. There had been something almost otherworldly about the way he'd appeared in my life at exactly the moment I needed him most. As I fell asleep, I wondered what secret Harold wanted to share with me, and why a simple conversation on a park bench had left me feeling more alive than I had in years. I arrived at the bench 15 minutes early the next day, my heart racing with an excitement I hadn't felt since childhood Christmas mornings. Harold was already there, wearing the same navy coat but with a leather messenger bag slung across his shoulder that I hadn't noticed the day before. He looked up as I approached, and his face broke into that same warm smile that had stopped me in my tracks yesterday. "Punctual," he said approvingly. "I like that in a person. Shows respect for other people's time." He patted the bench beside him, and I noticed he wasn't feeding the pigeons today. Instead, his attention seemed focused entirely on me, as if he'd been preparing for this moment all night. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," I began, settling in beside him. "About showing me something that would change how I see the city. I have to admit, I'm curious about what an 80-something-year-old man considers life-changing." Harold chuckled, but there was something almost secretive about his expression. 87, to be precise. "And you'd be surprised what someone my age has learned about seeing the invisible threads that connect us all." He reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook that looked like it had been handled thousands of times. "This," he said, holding the notebook like it was made of precious metal, "is my life's work. For the past 15 years, I've been documenting something extraordinary that happens right here in this park, something that most people are too busy or too skeptical to notice." I leaned closer, intrigued despite myself. Harold opened the notebook to reveal pages and pages of handwritten entries, each dated and meticulously detailed. The writing was small and precise, filling every inch of available space. "What kind of documentation?" I asked. "Connections," Harold said simply. "I watch for people who are lost, lonely, or at crossroads in their lives. Then I document what happens when the universe conspires to bring them exactly what they need." He flipped through several pages, and I caught glimpses of names, dates, and brief descriptions of encounters. "You mean like what happened with us yesterday?" I asked, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed what I was hearing. "Exactly like what happened with us yesterday," Harold confirmed. "Marcus, I've been coming to this bench for 15 years, and I've witnessed over 300 miraculous connections. People finding their future spouses, discovering long-lost siblings, meeting business partners who would change their lives forever. This park is like a magnet for souls who are meant to find each other." I stared at him, trying to process what he was telling me. It sounded like something out of a fantasy novel, yet Harold's matter-of-fact delivery made it seem almost plausible. "And you just watch this happen? Like some kind of guardian angel?" Harold's expression grew more serious. "Not exactly. You see, Marcus, I've discovered something remarkable about human connection. Sometimes, all it takes is one person who truly sees another person's need and is willing to act on it. I've become quite good at recognizing when someone is ready for a life-changing encounter." He turned to a specific page in his notebook and showed it to me. At the top, written in his careful handwriting, was yesterday's date. Below it, he'd written, "Marcus, young man, approximately 26, walking alone daily at 3:47 p.m. Profound loneliness, recent transplant to NYC. Ready for connection but has forgotten how to initiate it. Approached today." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You've been watching me for weeks," I said, and it wasn't a question. "I've been recognizing you," Harold corrected gently. "There's a difference. I see people who are broadcasting their need for connection, even when they don't realize they're doing it. Your body language, your walking pattern, the way you looked at other people in the park. It all told a story of someone who was desperately hoping for human connection but had given up believing it was possible." I should have felt disturbed by this revelation, but instead, I found myself deeply moved. Someone had seen me when I thought I was invisible. Someone had cared enough to pay attention to my story before I'd even told it. "But why?" I asked. Why do you spend your time doing this? Harold closed the notebook and held it against his chest like it contained his most precious memories. Because 15 years ago, I was sitting on this exact bench, 3 months after my wife Sarah died, contemplating whether life was worth living without her. I'd been married for 52 years, and suddenly I was completely alone for the first time in my adult life. His voice took on a distant quality, as if he was seeing that moment all over again. A young woman sat down next to me that day. She was crying about a job she'd just lost, and something about her tears made me forget my own grief long enough to offer her my handkerchief. We talked for 2 hours, and by the end of our conversation, we'd both found reasons to believe in tomorrow again. What happened to her? I asked softly. She got a better job 3 weeks later, met her future husband at the company Christmas party, and now has 2 beautiful children. But more importantly, she taught me that healing happens when we stop focusing on our own pain long enough to see someone else's need. Harold opened his notebook again and flipped to the very first entry. That's when I started documenting these connections. I realized this bench, this park, was where miracles happen every day. I felt tears forming in my eyes, though I couldn't explain exactly why. So you've been playing matchmaker for 15 years? Not matchmaker, Harold said firmly. Witness. Observer. Sometimes gentle facilitator. The connections happen naturally when people are ready for them. I just make sure the right people find themselves in the right place at the right time. He stood up and shouldered his messenger bag. Tomorrow, Marcus, I want to show you how this works. I want you to help me with someone who needs exactly what you needed yesterday. To remember that they're not invisible, that their story matters, that connection is possible even in a city of 8 million strangers. As Harold walked away, I sat on the bench for another hour, processing everything he'd told me. Was I part of some elaborate social experiment, or had I stumbled into something genuinely extraordinary? Either way, I knew I'd be back tomorrow. For the first time in years, I felt like I was part of something larger than myself. That night, I found myself looking at other people differently on my subway ride home. Instead of avoiding eye contact, I started noticing the subtle signs of loneliness Harold had taught me to recognize. The woman clutching her phone like a lifeline, the man reading the same page of his book over and over again, the teenager with headphones who kept glancing around hoping someone would notice her. Had I been broadcasting my own loneliness so obviously? I couldn't sleep that night. Harold's words kept echoing in my mind. I want you to help me with someone who needs exactly what you needed yesterday. What did that mean, exactly? Was I supposed to become some kind of amateur therapist, approaching strangers and offering unsolicited friendship? The thought terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. When I arrived at the bench the next afternoon, Harold was already there with his notebook open. But this time he was actively scanning the park with the focused intensity of a wildlife researcher. His eyes moved systematically from person to person, and I could almost see him cataloging details, assessing needs, calculating possibilities. Ah, Marcus, he said without taking his eyes off the crowd. Perfect timing. I want you to see something fascinating. He pointed to a woman in her 30s sitting alone on a bench about 50 yards away. She was dressed professionally, but her posture screamed defeat. Her shoulders were hunched, her head was down, and she was methodically shredding a tissue in her hands. What do you see when you look at her? Harold asked. I studied the woman more carefully. She looks upset about something. Maybe she just got bad news? Lost her job? Relationship problems. As I watched, she pulled out her phone, started to dial, then hung up before the call connected. She did this 3 times in a row. Excellent observation, Harold said approvingly. Now, what else do you notice about her surroundings? I looked around the woman's bench and saw something I'd missed before. About 30 feet to her left, a man in his 40s was sitting alone, reading a book. Every few minutes, he'd glance in her direction with what looked like concern, then return to his reading. He'd obviously noticed her distress but didn't know how to approach her. The man with the book, I said. He's noticed her too. Very good. Now watch what happens when someone bridges that gap. Harold stood up and began walking toward the woman, his notebook tucked under his arm. I followed at a distance, fascinated to see his method in action. Harold approached the woman's bench slowly, non-threateningly. Instead of sitting down immediately, he paused near her and said, "Excuse me, miss, but I couldn't help noticing that you dropped something." He pointed to a spot near her feet where there was obviously nothing on the ground. The woman looked up, confused. "I don't think I dropped anything," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. "Oh, my mistake," Harold said with a gentle smile. "My eyesight isn't what it used to be. Mind if I sit for a moment? These old legs need a rest." Without waiting for permission, he settled beside her, maintaining enough distance to be respectful but close enough to signal his availability for conversation. "Rough day?" he asked simply. The floodgates opened. The woman, whose name was Jennifer, I learned, had just been fired from a job she'd held for 8 years. She'd been trying to call her sister for support, but kept losing her nerve because she was ashamed of her failure. Harold listened with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world, occasionally offering gentle words of encouragement. After about 10 minutes, Harold did something unexpected. He called out to the man with the book. "Excuse me, sir. You wouldn't happen to work in marketing, would you? My new friend Jennifer here is looking for advice from someone in her field, and you have the look of someone who might understand corporate culture." The man looked up, surprised to be addressed by a stranger, but Harold's warm demeanor seemed to disarm him immediately. "Actually, I do work in marketing," he said, closing his book and walking over. 20 years in the industry. What kind of advice does she need?" What followed was remarkable to witness. Harold had created a natural reason for two strangers to connect, removing the awkwardness that usually prevents people from reaching out to each other. Jennifer found herself talking to David, the marketing executive, about her career challenges, while Harold gradually faded into the background, letting their connection develop organically. Within 30 minutes, David had not only offered Jennifer valuable career advice but had also mentioned that his company was hiring. They exchanged contact information, and by the time they parted ways, Jennifer's entire demeanor had transformed from despair to hope. Harold and I walked back to our bench in silence. I was processing what I'd just witnessed. It was like watching a master craftsman at work, but instead of wood or metal, Harold was sculpting human connections. "How did you know?" I asked finally. "How did you know David worked in marketing, or that he'd be willing to help?" Harold smiled mysteriously. "I didn't know for certain about the marketing, but I'd been watching him for 20 minutes before you arrived. He was reading The Lean Startup and taking notes in the margins, behavior that suggested someone actively engaged in business strategy. More importantly, he'd been glancing at Jennifer with obvious concern. He wanted to help but didn't know how to break the social barrier." "So you became the bridge," I said, understanding dawning. "Exactly. Sometimes all people need is permission to care about each other, a socially acceptable reason to cross the invisible lines we draw around ourselves in public spaces." Harold opened his notebook and began writing a new entry about Jennifer and David's connection. "Now," he said, looking up at me with those penetrating eyes, "I want you to try it. Look around this park and tell me what you see." I spent several minutes scanning the area, trying to apply Harold's method. Finally, I spotted something promising. "There," I said, pointing to a teenage girl sitting alone near the playground. "She keeps looking at the kids playing, but she's too old to join them and too young to be a parent watching her own children. She looks lonely." "Good eye," Harold said. "What else?" I looked more carefully. "There's an older woman feeding ducks at the pond, maybe in her 60s. She keeps smiling at the girl but hasn't approached her. She might be someone's grandmother missing her own grandchildren." Harold beamed at me like a proud teacher. "Perfect. Now, how might you create a bridge between them?" My heart started racing. The theoretical was becoming practical, and I wasn't sure I had the courage to actually approach strangers. But Harold's expectant expression gave me strength. I could ask the older woman about the ducks, maybe mention that the teenage girl seems interested in them too. Excellent instinct, Harold said. Remember, you're not manufacturing a fake connection. You're simply removing the barriers that prevent natural human kindness from flowing. Go ahead, I'll be watching from here. With trembling hands and a racing heart, I walked toward the pond. The older woman looked up as I approached, her face kind but cautious. Beautiful ducks, I said, my voice shakier than I'd intended. Oh yes, she replied warmly. I've been coming here for years to feed them. They're like old friends now. She had a slight Irish accent that made her words sound musical. I noticed that young girl over there seems fascinated by them too, I said, nodding toward the teenager. She's been watching for a while but looks too shy to come over. The woman followed my gaze and her expression softened immediately. Ah, the poor thing does look a bit lost, doesn't she? When I was her age, I was terribly shy too. Without any prompting from me, she walked over to the girl with her bag of duck food. Would you like to help me feed them, love? I heard her ask. They're quite friendly once you get to know them. I watched from a distance as the teenager's face lit up with genuine joy. Within minutes, they were chatting comfortably, the older woman sharing stories about the different ducks' personalities while the girl listened with rapt attention. They spent the next hour together, and I could see the loneliness melting away from both of them. When I returned to Harold, my hands were shaking with adrenaline and something else, a profound sense of purpose I'd never experienced before. How does it feel? Harold asked quietly. Like I just discovered a superpower I never knew I had, I said, still watching the woman and girl by the pond. Is it always this easy? Harold chuckled. Easy? No. But it becomes natural with practice. What you just experienced, Marcus, is what happens when you stop being a passive observer of the world and start being an active participant in other people's stories. You've just taken your first step toward understanding what I've been doing for 15 years. As we sat watching the sunset paint the park in golden hues, I felt something fundamental shifting inside me. For the first time in my adult life, I understood that loneliness wasn't an inevitable condition. It was a solvable problem. And somehow, I'd become part of the solution. Over the next 2 weeks, Harold and I met at the bench every afternoon. What started as casual observation evolved into something resembling a masterclass in human connection. Harold's notebook revealed itself to be far more than a simple journal. It was a comprehensive map of the invisible networks that bind people together in unexpected ways. Look at this, Harold said one cloudy Thursday, flipping to a section I'd never seen before. The pages were covered with intricate diagrams that looked like family trees, but instead of blood relations, they showed connection chains. Remember Jennifer and David from last week? Jennifer got the job, but that's just the beginning of the story. He traced his finger along a series of connected names. David introduced Jennifer to his colleague Sarah, who became Jennifer's mentor. Sarah's daughter was struggling with depression, so Jennifer, who'd been through her own dark period, became a support system for the girl. The daughter, inspired by Jennifer's resilience, decided to volunteer at a suicide prevention hotline, where she's already helped dozens of people. I stared at the diagram, amazed by its complexity. You track all of this. When you create one meaningful connection, Marcus, you're not just helping 2 people. You're creating ripple effects that touch countless lives, often in ways you'll never even know about. Harold flipped through more pages, showing me similar chains of connection spanning years. This is incredible, I said. But how do you follow up with everyone? How do you know what happens to them? Harold smiled mysteriously. That's where the network comes in. I'm not the only one doing this work, Marcus. There are others, scattered throughout the city, all quietly facilitating connections. We stay in touch, share information, help each other identify people who need what we do. Others like you? I felt my worldview expanding yet again. How many others? In New York. Maybe 30 or 40 active facilitators. Worldwide. Hundreds. We don't have meetings or official organizations. It's more organic than that. We find each other the same way we find the people who need our help. Harold reached into his messenger bag and pulled out an old flip phone. "But we do communicate." As if on cue, the phone buzzed with a text message. Harold read it, and his expression grew serious. "Speaking of which, we have a situation. Emergency at Washington Square Park. Someone's in crisis, and the local facilitator needs backup." "Emergency?" I asked, alarmed. Sometimes people reach breaking points before they're ready to accept help. When that happens, we coordinate to provide immediate support. Harold stood up quickly, suddenly looking every bit his 87 years. "I need to go. Are you coming?" I didn't hesitate. We took a taxi to Washington Square Park, where Harold led me to a bench near the fountain. A woman in her 50s was sitting with a young man who couldn't have been older than 25. The woman, who I assumed was the local facilitator, caught Harold's eye and nodded subtly toward a corner of the park. There, sitting alone under a tree, was a man in his 40s. He was dressed in an expensive suit, but everything about his posture screamed desperation. His hands were shaking, and he kept checking his watch as if he was running out of time for something. "Corporate executive," the woman explained quietly when we approached. "Lost everything in a financial scandal that wasn't his fault. Wife left him, kids won't speak to him, facing bankruptcy and possible jail time. He's been sitting there for 3 hours, and I'm worried about his intentions." Harold studied the man with the intense focus I'd come to recognize. "What have you tried so far, Elena?" "The usual approaches aren't working. He's too defensive, too ashamed to accept help from a stranger. I think he needs to hear from someone who's been through something similar." Elena looked at Harold expectantly. "Your notebook. Do you have anyone in your network who's overcome a public fall from grace?" Harold was already flipping through his phone contacts. "Thomas Chen, investment banker who lost everything in 2008, contemplated suicide, rebuilt his life from scratch. He's in Brooklyn now, runs a non-profit helping other executives transition out of high-stress careers." He dialed a number. "Thomas? Harold. I need a favor." What happened next was unlike anything I'd witnessed before. Within 30 minutes, Thomas arrived at the park. But instead of approaching the desperate man directly, he sat on a nearby bench and began making phone calls, loudly enough for the man to overhear, but naturally enough not to seem staged. "I understand completely," Thomas said into his phone. "The shame is almost unbearable at first. You feel like everyone's staring at you, judging you, waiting for you to fail again. But I promise you, it gets better. You have to believe that your value as a human being isn't determined by your net worth or your professional status." The man under the tree looked up, clearly listening. Thomas continued his performance, sharing details about his own fall from grace, his recovery process, the life he'd built on the other side of catastrophe. After about 15 minutes, the man stood up and walked over to Thomas. "Excuse me," he said hesitantly. "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation. Did you really lose everything?" Thomas looked up with surprise that seemed genuine but was probably carefully practiced. "I did. 8 years ago." "Why do you ask?" What followed was a 2-hour conversation that probably saved a life. Thomas didn't offer quick fixes or false hope. Instead, he provided something more valuable. Proof that survival was possible, that identity could be rebuilt, that shame eventually transforms into wisdom if you let it. By the time we left Washington Square Park, the man had Thomas's contact information, a referral to a crisis counselor, and most importantly, a reason to believe that tomorrow might be different from today. "This is what you do?" I asked Harold as we rode the subway back to Central Park. "You respond to emergencies across the city?" "When necessary, yes. But it's not just about crisis intervention, Marcus. It's about building a safety net of human connections so comprehensive that fewer people fall through the cracks in the first place." Harold looked tired after the afternoon's intensity. "What you witnessed today is the network in action. Elena identified someone in crisis, I connected her with Thomas. Thomas provided exactly what that man needed to hear. No single person could have saved him alone." How did you know Thomas would be available? What if he'd said no? He wouldn't have said no, Harold replied with absolute certainty. Once you understand how this network operates, saying no becomes impossible. We've all been where that man was today, in different ways. We know what it feels like to be completely alone in your darkest moment. I thought about this as we emerged from the subway into the evening air. Harold, how did you find the other facilitators? How did this network start? Harold stopped walking and turned to look at me with an expression I couldn't read. That's a story for tomorrow, Marcus. But I will say this, the network found me the same way it's finding you right now. The same way it finds everyone who's meant to be part of it. What do you mean, the way it's finding me? Harold smiled enigmatically. You'll understand soon enough. Come back tomorrow, same time. I have something very important to show you, something I've been saving until you were ready to see it. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the network of facilitators Harold had revealed. How many times in my life had I encountered people who might have been part of this invisible safety net? How many moments of kindness from strangers had actually been coordinated acts of connection? The idea that there were dozens of people throughout the city quietly working to prevent loneliness and crisis felt almost too good to be true. But I'd seen it in action. I'd been part of it. And somehow, I knew that tomorrow would bring revelations that would change everything I thought I understood about my place in the world. I arrived at our bench early again, but this time Harold wasn't there waiting for me. Instead, there was a young woman sitting in his usual spot, reading his leather notebook. She looked up as I approached, and I was struck by her remarkable resemblance to Harold. The same intelligent eyes, the same warm smile, the same air of knowing something the rest of the world had yet to discover. You must be Marcus, she said, standing to greet me. I'm Sarah. Harold asked me to meet you here today. Where is Harold? I asked, though something in her expression already suggested this wasn't going to be a simple answer. Sit down, Sarah said gently, patting the bench beside her. There are some things about Harold that you need to know, things that will help you understand why he chose you, and what he's been preparing you for. I sat down, my heart starting to race with an anxiety I couldn't name. Is he okay? Is he sick? Sarah smiled, but there was sadness in it. Marcus, Harold died 3 weeks ago. The words hit me like a physical blow. That's impossible. I just saw him yesterday. We went to Washington Square Park together. He made phone calls, we talked to Elena and Thomas. I trailed off, seeing the gentle compassion in Sarah's eyes. You saw what you needed to see, she said softly. Harold had a gift, Marcus. The same gift you're developing. He could appear to people who needed him, could facilitate connections even after his death. But yesterday was his final intervention. He used the last of his energy to show you how the network operates because he knew you were ready to take his place. I stared at her, my mind reeling. You're telling me Harold was a ghost? That I've been talking to a dead person for 3 weeks? Not exactly a ghost, Sarah said. More like an echo of someone who loved this world so much that he couldn't bear to leave it while there were still people who needed help finding each other. Harold's body died, but his purpose was stronger than death. She opened the notebook to the first page, and I saw something I'd never noticed before, an inscription in different handwriting. For Harold Goldstein, who taught us that love is the only force stronger than loneliness. May your work continue through others. The Network, 2010. Harold wasn't the first facilitator, Marcus. He was part of a tradition that goes back generations. People who understand that human connection is so fundamental to survival that some souls refuse to rest until they've trained others to carry on the work. But I touched him. I protested. We shook hands. He was solid, real. He was real, Sarah confirmed. Just not in the way you thought. Harold's love for this work, his commitment to helping others, was so strong that it created a kind of spiritual presence that could interact with the physical world when someone needed it badly enough. I thought back to our first meeting, How Harold had seemed to appear at exactly the moment I needed him most, how he'd known so much about my routines and patterns without me telling him. How long has he been gone? Harold died of a heart attack in his apartment 15 years ago, Sarah said quietly. Right after his wife Sarah passed away. But the next day, he appeared on this bench to a lonely young woman who was crying about losing her job. That was his first intervention after death. He's been appearing to people who needed him ever since. And you are? I'm Sarah Goldstein, Harold's granddaughter. I'm also one of the living facilitators in the network. She smiled at my shocked expression. The network is made up of both the living and the, let's call them the persistent dead. Souls who loved the work so much they couldn't let go of it. I felt dizzy trying to process this information. Why me? Why did Harold choose me to, replace him? Sarah flipped through the notebook to show me pages and pages of observations about me dating back months, not weeks. Harold had been watching you since you moved to New York, Marcus. You have something rare, the ability to see people's true needs, to recognize when someone is broadcasting loneliness or desperation. But more than that, you have the emotional capacity to care about strangers without expecting anything in return. She pointed to a detailed entry about me from 6 months ago. Marcus shows consistent patterns of noticing isolated individuals but lacks confidence to approach them. High empathy, low self-worth, recent trauma from failed relationship. Perfect candidate for facilitator training once he's ready to value his own gifts. Harold spent months studying you, waiting for the right moment to reveal himself. He knew you were meant for this work, but you had to discover it naturally. Everything that's happened between you two was designed to awaken abilities you already possessed. I looked around the park, seeing it differently now. Are there others like Harold? Dead facilitators who still appear to people? A few. The work chooses people, Marcus, both in life and after death. Some souls are so committed to preventing loneliness and despair that they find ways to continue serving even after their bodies give out. Sarah closed the notebook and handed it to me. This is yours now. Harold's life work, his methods, his network contacts. Everything you need to carry on what he started. I don't know if I can do this, I said, overwhelmed by the responsibility she was placing in my hands. Harold believed you could, Sarah said firmly. And Harold was never wrong about people. You've already proven yourself, Marcus. The connections you've facilitated over the past few weeks, the lives you've touched, that was all you. Harold was just giving you permission to trust your instincts. She stood up and shouldered her own messenger bag. The network will support you. Elena from Washington Square Park will be your primary contact, and there are others throughout the city who will help you learn advanced techniques. But the most important thing Harold wanted me to tell you is this: you're not alone in this work. You never will be. Will I see Harold again? I asked, surprised by how much the answer mattered to me. Sarah's smile was both sad and hopeful. That depends on how much you need him. The connection between facilitators transcends death, Marcus. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you truly need Harold's guidance, he'll find a way to appear to you. But his hope is that you'll become strong enough to help others without needing help yourself. As she walked away, I sat on the bench holding Harold's notebook, trying to absorb everything I'd learned. The man who had saved me from loneliness, who had taught me to see the invisible connections between people, had been dead for 15 years. But somehow, that made his gift to me even more profound. I opened the notebook to the page where Harold had first written about me, and saw a new entry in his familiar handwriting, dated today. Marcus has learned the truth and chosen to continue the work. The circle is complete. The network lives on. Death is not the end. It is simply the moment we trust others to carry what we can no longer bear alone. Welcome to your true purpose, my friend. The bench is yours now. As I closed the notebook, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood, absolute certainty about my place in the world. Tomorrow, I would return to this bench and begin watching for lonely souls who needed what I had once needed. The network would guide me, the work would sustain me, and Harold's legacy would live on through every connection I helped create. For the first time in my life, I understood that I was exactly where I was meant to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. Death had not ended Harold's story, it had simply passed the pen to me to write the next chapter.